I'm Christine Beckman, professor at the Price School, associate of the Center for Social Innovation, and it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, our first virtual seminar of the year, Mikia Castillo, who is the co-founder and principal at Castillo Consulting Partners. Mikia actually has an MPP and an MUP from USC, so she's got some good USC roots. She's from South Central Los Angeles, and so is sort of very familiar with our local environment. Her firm is committed to empowering diverse leaders. She has worked in the public, the nonprofit, and the private sector, working around issues of social justice, racial equity, social change. She's done grassroots organizing, working with Black Lives Matter. She does strategic planning, design thinking, systems change. An enormous array of areas where she's brings her expertise. In addition, she's taught the social innovation class as an adjunct in years past, so she's very familiar with the social innovation framework. And I'm so delighted that you could join us today. Thank you for taking a day out of your vacation to actually be with us and speak with us about social innovation in today's world. So I picked as the topic, really thinking about so much is happening in today's world, issues around racial equity, and it felt like we really needed to think about social innovation, not just in a broad sense, but in a very particular way around what's happening today and how that changes and impacts what we think about as social innovation. But as we get started, I thought it would be most useful if you could start and just tell us a little bit more about your background and the work that you're currently doing.
Thanks, Christine. Thanks for having me. And social innovation students and guests, it's a real honor and pleasure to be here with you all for this conversation. I'm really honored. As Christine mentioned, I'm on the last day of my vacation. Some of you, I think I had a chance to connect with last week on the first day of my vacation when I got to speak with the planning students around I think it's careers in social justice or something like that with Dr. Marlon Burnett and Dr. Lavana Lewis. But anyhow, I'm again really honored to be here with you. So as Professor Beckman mentioned, I currently am running an organization or company called Castillo Consulting Partners with my husband, Daniel Castillo. And we started this company just a little over a year ago with actually the idea of being innovative, focusing on social innovation in a lot of different ways. So it's always interesting to hear when people read about me or like say my bio or what I've done. I'm like, is that really me? I attribute so much of it to what I learned as a student in the Price School, fight on all the Trojans, and also the opportunities that I've had throughout my life to use my background growing up in South Central, being a first generation college student, coming from a family who has roots both in the US as Black folks in the US as well as immigrants from Central America, to really shape the way that I think about policy, urban planning, social justice, and also the way I move within the world. And so when we started this firm, our vision was that we would be able to really help develop leaders at all levels, right? So young people who come from low income communities that don't have access to resources, how do we help them to develop their leadership and give them voice in the spaces where power exists? How do we develop leaders in the spaces where power exists in the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector, right? Definitely a Price School, one of the things we talk about the Price School is public, private, nonprofit partnerships. And so I've really taken that to heart and brought it into the business to think about what does it look like to develop leaders in those spaces where power exists, but the voices of the most vulnerable, the voices of the folks who our policies are supposed to be serving are actually missing from the conversation. So how do we develop those leaders to really think about those communities and not just think about them, but bring them into the fold more intentionally? And so all of the principles that you all talk about in your social innovation class are rooted in what I do and also in what I teach. So I guess that's a little bit about, kind of vaguely about the work that I'm doing. We can get into the details, I guess, throughout the conversation.
Terrific. And I didn't do a sort of an overview of how we thought we'd structure this, so that I have not a lot of questions, half a dozen questions that I will pose, and then there's the Q&A spot on your Zoom, so please feel free to post questions there as we go along. And we're hoping to spend a good chunk of this hour really answering your questions and having a bigger conversation. So please do add questions as we go along, and I will get to them sort of once I get through my set of questions. So can we start then by talking about what, in the last, so since we've started protests, and so systemic racism has been here for a long time. This is not a new problem, but the intensity and this moment feels really big and really powerful to me. And I'm wondering for you what this moment feels like as someone who's spent a career really working on and addressing these issues. And so what does that heightened attention sort of mean for the work you're doing, and does it change the work that you're able to do or what you see happening?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I'm glad you asked that one after asking me about what I'm doing now, because it actually reminded me that one of the things that I forgot to do in my, I'm in vacation mode, and also my 10-month-old baby was making some noise in the background, was to start off my introduction by doing a land acknowledgement, which is one of the practices that we use in our work, as well as a labor acknowledgement. And I think it's important for us to do land and labor acknowledgements to recognize the history of systemic racism in this country, and also the ways that history shapes how our country looks today, and the ways that things continue to operate. And so for a land acknowledgement, I just want to acknowledge the fact that where we sit here in Southern California and Los Angeles is historically the Tongva land, and this land actually was inhabited by other people before you and I got here, before anybody else arrived here, and that land was stolen from those individuals. And that we need to acknowledge that and recognize that, because when we erase that history, we erase the stories of those individuals, and we don't acknowledge that systemic racism has really shaped where we sit as a people. And then the labor acknowledgement, which is something that we've adopted from Dr. Melina Abdullah, who was one of the founding members of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, and many of you have seen her in the media recently. And the labor acknowledgement basically says that we also acknowledge the Africans who were stolen from Africa and brought to the US and have built this country as we know it, right? The economic fabric of the United States of America is built on the backs of enslaved people, my ancestors. They never succumbed to the idea that they were enslaved human beings, because if they did, I wouldn't be here free as I am right now. And I just want to acknowledge that and pay homage to them and pay homage to the indigenous folks who inhabited this land. So with that, I think
can I ask you a question about that? Actually, I thank you for that. I mean, I have a much older child, a college-age child, who studied in Australia in the fall, right, just in the nick of time to do her overseas. And one of the things that she was struck by was that land acknowledgement was something that every place you visited in Australia, they did and talked about the indigenous people. And so I'm sort of curious the history of that here, because we had noted how rarely those acknowledgements happened anywhere you might visit. Not only just in conversation, but you visit a historical site, right? The history of that. So could you tell us a little bit about sort of what the history of those land and labor acknowledgements is? Because I find it super important.
No, absolutely. And so in terms of the land acknowledgement, I think it's our indigenous brothers and sisters here, right? Again, we're on Tongva land, and the Chumash tribe also inhabited the land that we are on in Southern California. It's been a call from indigenous people to say, we even though, the folks who came to the US tried to commit genocide against our people, we are not extinct. We are here. This land is our land. It belongs to us. It belonged to us historically. And our whole diaspora of people over multiple generations have suffered from this, systemic racism and the attempts of genocide. And so we want that acknowledgement that this is our land. And I think that is important and necessary. And I don't want to just, do a land acknowledgement just to say I've done it. It's really to take a moment to pause and reflect on the fact that I am living in a space that belongs to a people, and it was stolen, right? And so I think that history is incredibly important. And the labor acknowledgement, Dr. Melina Abdullah put out to actually indigenous brothers and sisters recently to say this also, the land was stolen, and then the land was worked by enslaved human beings. And that also needs to be acknowledged. And I think one of the reasons why innovation, social innovation is so challenging is because people don't actually, I think it is a challenge to be socially innovative, actually, right? So I guess I should say that first. And I think part of the reason is because folks don't necessarily believe that there needs to be this level of innovation because they don't see that there's anything wrong, right? I think people see that there are some problems, but they don't fundamentally understand that the problems are always rooted in systemic racism. It's rooted in the way that capitalism was introduced in our country, which was literally on the backs of enslaved African people, right? Like, we would not be as far along economically as we are as a country. We would not be the world power that we are as a nation, if not for the fact that we had enslaved human beings who worked for hundreds of years for free, right, to build this country. And so when you have that, like that type of history, it's so important for us to understand that and see the connections between that past and the present, and how things maybe have shifted some, but they actually, when people say history repeats itself, I'm like, I don't know, history has just continued on without an acknowledgement of the fact that this is what has shaped who we are and where we are today, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, thank you. All right, so then maybe we can go back to the question of this moment, right? And sort of what the heightened attention sort of has meant in the kind of work that you're doing and trying to be socially innovative.
No, absolutely. I think a couple things. One, the first thing I'll say is that for some of us, I mean, it is amazing to see how many people are now starting to understand the depths of these issues that we've been talking about for a long time, right? I think it's really unfortunate that it took another Black man being murdered on video for people to see this, in order for people to see how serious these issues are. For many of us, right, this has been my whole life. And I tell folks that all the time. Yes, I have multiple degrees from USC, certificates from USC. I teach at USC. Yes, I went to a UC for undergrad. I'm a first generation college student. None of that takes away from the history and my experience with racism in my life throughout my entire life, with police brutality, not just in the past few years, not in the past, just the past 7 years since Trayvon Martin was killed and Black Lives Matter came to be, but my entire life, like from the time that I was a little girl growing up in South Central, I have memories of police brutality, of police coming in, busting into my family's home with, like Breonna Taylor, where they had the no-knock warrant, if folks who have heard about her story, and busting the door down with a battery ram. That was my experience as a 3-year-old. And I was traumatized by that experience. And all of that has shaped the reason why I do the work that I do, right? The reason why I've chosen to focus my career in policy, in urban planning, and leadership development, and helping people to understand the need for diversity, equity, inclusion, access, and anti-racism to be foundational to everything that we do. And so when I think about the fact that for so many people, this moment feels really big, it feels really big for me too. And it also feels like, finally, right, we're getting some traction, some movement over issues that many of us have been living through our entire lives. And for some folks, this is the first time that they're really aware that this is happening. And so for our work, I think it means that there's a lot more room for conversations like this, right? For us to be able to have a discussion around, what does it look like to be innovative in this space? What does it look like for us to reimagine the world that we live in and the way that our country operates, which I think is a huge part of innovation, right? Innovation to me is really about uprooting the systems that some people will say broken. I think that a lot of the systems that we have are operating the ways that they were designed to operate. And so it's not that the system is broken. We need to uproot the system that is not working the way that it should for everybody, but is working really well for some, if that makes sense. And so I think that in this moment, there is really room for us to be creative, to be radical in a sense, right? I mean, that's what you're seeing with some of the conversations around the country now around defunding the police. That is an innovative idea, to think that, okay, we're funding the police at LA to the tune of over 50% of our budget. What if we didn't fund the police to the tune of 50% of our budget and defunded them and gave those resources to other, to serving the community, to more money to education? And for some people, that's just like a wild concept. What do you mean? And in fact, I've been teaching that in my classes for several years now at USC. I've had students think about, we work in the public space. we talk about these wicked problems in public policy. We talk about these challenges in communities. Why is there so much homelessness? When we ask, local elected officials, we need to build more housing, what is the primary response that we get? Oh, well, we don't have any resources for that. We need more money, right? When we say we need more public transportation, we need more buses in South LA, we need to expand our light rail system. The question is, where are we going to get the resources? So then if we don't have those resources, or we're being told that we don't have those resources, when people start to peel back the layers and look at, well, we're all being taxed, right? Where's that money going? And they see what that pie looks like. I think it's really innovative, a social innovation to say, how about we really reimagine how we allocate the resources in that pie? Because is it really that we don't have the resources, or is it that we're not allocating the resources to the places where we need to be? So that's, I think it's opened up a big door for us to start thinking more holistically about the services that we offer, not just the services, like what is our community, what do we want our community to look like, and how do we do that with the resources we have, since we know we have a finite amount of resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the defunding the police is a great example of an innovative idea. So how much in the work that you're doing are you seeing things like that, where we have really new approaches to social change, new ideas, versus doing some of the things that we traditional social change, right? There's a lot to be said for, we know what to do, we just haven't been able to get people to be on board. So where do you see that balance between sort of traditional social change metrics and really trying to come up with new ideas and social innovations?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I do feel like a lot of my work is rooted in trying to get people on board with ideas that have been around already for a while, right? Like even I just use defunding the police as a social innovation, but really it's just participatory budgeting, which is not that new of a concept, but has not gained as much traction as I think it could or should, right? Some of the work that we've done with Castillo Consulting Partners recently is we did a feasibility analysis for LA County Commission for Children and Families to determine whether or not the county had internally what it needed to have a youth advisory body, right? Having youth voices included in our decision-making processes is not a new concept. But LA County, one of the largest in the country, didn't have a body of young people who were impacted by the system, right? Probation youth, foster youth, homeless youth, LGBT youth, who could actually have like the ear of the elected officials. And so you're right, it's not necessarily that it's a super new or innovative idea, but the ways in which we're getting these ideas to the people who make the decisions, I think is a little more innovative, right? So if I go back to the people's budget, this participatory budgeting process in the midst of a pandemic, you can't get people in person to do budgeting, right? Because we're in quarantine. So then how do you get people's voices involved? Well, we use some pretty traditional tools, surveying, but then you use innovative approaches like social media, right? So we have a survey that goes out on Twitter and on Facebook and on Instagram, and people are able to share their responses and thoughts in ways that the local government is not engaging community members, right? So I think there's like a combination of approaches that have been used before but haven't necessarily gotten the traction that they need to get folks really engaged in innovative solutions to some of the wicked problems. And then there's this piece where these ideas are not necessarily new, but they're being used in new ways to get more community participation, which I think is really critical to innovation.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're speaking to in the context of how I think about it, sort of the social innovation process, right? The incorporation of voices and stakeholders and getting people involved at every stage of the process, and really hearing those voices and lifting those up, bringing them in early. That's part of a social innovation process. It doesn't matter if the idea is new. What matters is are those voices part of that process, and that by itself makes it in many ways a social innovation that we are valuing and rising up, lifting up those voices. So I think that that makes sense sort of in the participatory budgeting sort of framework. So another question for you: what are some of the limitations you see in the current existing efforts that are happening now?
Yeah, I think yes. There's still a lot of limitations, right? One is that not everybody has access to internet. Not everybody has access to the resources and tools that are being used to move forward with social innovation processes as you just described them. You know, we have seen a lot more public participation on Zoom calls and meetings and things of that nature. I've been on several where there literally are thousands of people who are trying to get access to talk to their elected officials, to talk to commissioners, to talk to whomever, to say this, you know, I want to be a part of this process. And I think it speaks to the fact that there has always been a need and a desire to include all of these different voices in the process, whatever that process may be, right? Budgeting, policy decision-making, whatever it is, but we haven't done a good job of incorporating them. I think that technology is helping, but there are still limitations to the technology, right? I saw on social media just a couple days ago, some little girls who are, you know, of course, most children are back in school, but they're in virtual classrooms where there were two elementary school girls sitting in front of a Taco Bell to get free Wi-Fi because they don't have Wi-Fi at their homes to access school, right? That's a real concern. That was not in another country. That was right here in the United States of America, very likely here in Los Angeles. I know in my neighborhood, there are a lot of people who don't have access to the internet. And I've seen, you know, Spectrum, which is a private company, every day coming in, trying to fix people's internet connectivity issues. And so, or they're also giving them internet connectivity. So I think that that's one of the limitations. Another limitation, honestly, is that some of our elected officials really just do not care to hear the voices of the community members. And I know that that is hard for some people to hear, but that has been my experience, right? It's been my experience, is what I see. That this is why you have folks like Black Lives Matter and allies showing up to different elected officials' homes, right? Going to the mayor's house. Hey, mayor, you're not hearing us. We're going to show up at your house. You're not hearing us. We're going to show up at this meeting. And so I feel like limitation is when we have folks in office who are not necessarily responding to the voices of the community, especially the voices that have been excluded for so long, then you are not able to move forward with innovative solutions in the ways that I think we should be right now.
What's a moment actually for me to ask one of the questions that have come in. David Sloan has a question, articulate as all. Yeah. And I think he asked an important question here, which is, you know, how do you stay positive in the face of so much trauma and so much resistance?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a few ways that I stay positive. One is I get really excited about seeing more people have an awakening, right? That's one of the reasons why I love to teach, because it's great to be in a classroom with folks who come in with one perspective, and then we have these really rich conversations and dialogue around, you know, Professor Sloan is a historian, so he knows, right? When people are exposed to the truth, you can't turn that off, I feel like. And so that gives me hope, and that keeps me smiling and happy in the midst of all the trauma. My faith is a big part of that too. I don't know, like I fundamentally believe that the reason that I have, that I'm still alive today, having been through, Breonna Taylor was killed, right? Like she literally was shot and killed by the police who came into her home with a battery ram. I was sitting on a couch as the 3-year-old and had the police come into my home. And I knew, like, that has been etched in my brain for my entire life. And I feel like I was protected by God, right? My faith has been a big part of that. And then the other thing is my family and my community. I still, like, I live, you hear my baby in the background? Yes.
Great, on cue. He was on cue.
He's always on cue. If you are on any of my calls for work, you will hear Justice chime in right when I'm, you know, when it was like the right timing. But my family and my community is also a big, you know, reason why I continue to do this work. Everybody who knows me knows that I have lots of nieces and nephews, right? I have a 10-month-old. I've been married for 13 years. I just celebrated 13 years of marriage last Tuesday. Don't tell my husband I said Monday, it was Tuesday. But it's knowing, being close to my community members, being close to my family, and knowing that we don't have a choice except to continue with this fight to change the world. Like, we have to be innovative. We have to come up with solutions, and we have to push for those solutions in order to get the world that we want. That keeps me motivated and keeps me happy. And then I just like to dance and I like to sing, and I go for runs, right? And of course now I have a baby, and I will say that as difficult as it is to have a baby in the midst of a pandemic, when there's a racial and like a global uprising against racism, and I'm in quarantine, it is also such a tremendous blessing, because I can look at him and like all those things kind of go away, and yet they're still there. And I'm thinking I have to continue this struggle in order, like, so that you don't have to fight this fight when you get to the age where you're aware of the fact that this is even a fight that has to happen.
Well, so let's staying on that positive note then. Thank you for that. So what are some of the innovative ideas that you are excited about? So when you look out and think of social innovation, what are you most excited about these days?
These days, I mean, I'm really excited about like this People's Budget LA, the participatory budgeting process. The idea of having community members actually participate in making decisions about a budget for the whole city really, really excites me, because I think how different would LA look if people had more insight into how resources are allocated and then can actually weigh in. I don't know what that's going to look like moving forward, but I do get excited about the idea that that people will have an opportunity to weigh in on these processes. I also get excited about reimagining public safety. I really do. I don't know, again, what that's going to look like down the line, but I identify as an abolitionist. I think that is also an innovative approach, right? Like I tell my students always, this was like in the past 3 to 5 years, people have thought I was crazy. They're like, "You're crazy. What do you mean you're an abolitionist? Like slavery ended a long time ago, right?" And I tell them that that's not true. It didn't end a long time ago. And I also say to students that the folks who were abolitionists way back when, who wanted to abolish slavery, people also thought that they were crazy. Right. And they also didn't believe that it was possible. And they were able to imagine a different world in which human beings were not enslaved, and they were able to make that happen. And it's not perfect, but I'm here because of that. Right. And so I get excited about the idea of reimagining public safety and not relying on law enforcement to do everything. Right. Like if there's a person who's having a mental health crisis, I don't feel like it's that innovative to say we don't need a police officer to be the one to respond to that, right? Like we really should have a person who's professionally trained to deal with people who are having mental health crises, not a person with a gun. The idea of not having police on school campuses, like that's a foreign concept to so many of us who grew up with police on school campuses, but that actually was not the case 40 years ago, right? What would it look like for us to have different people responding to the needs of our students, and people wrapping their arms around our students and saying, you're acting out in the classroom, let's get at the root of what's going on, versus we're going to criminalize you because you were ditching class, or you got into a fight with students. Let's really try to wrap our arms around you and give you the supports that you need to be able to thrive and like live into who you are versus who you are acting out to be right now. So those types of things get me excited. I'm also doing some really exciting work around child welfare that gets me excited. The way that our child welfare system works here in this country, I think is causing a lot more harm than good. I don't think it is. I know for a fact that it is. I've had a chance to work with a lot of foster youth, especially transition age foster youth over the years. My husband and I have been kinship caregivers. We've also been foster parents. And our experience is that the system is really failing to meet the needs of children, especially Black children. LA County has the largest child welfare population in the country, right? About 1/5 of the foster kids in the country are here in Los Angeles. Just last year, the Board of Supervisors produced a report actually it came from the state, but basically they said, we recognize that there's an issue here. Black children are way overrepresented, right? To like 2.5 to 3 times their population share. And when I look at something like that, I ask 2 questions. Who's at fault here, right? Who's at fault? Do we believe that it's Black folks that are just, something's wrong with Black people, or is there something wrong with the system? And 10 times out of 10, there's something wrong with the system. It's not that there's something fundamentally wrong with Black people, so we need to fix the system. And I'm excited about some of the work that's coming down the pike with that, where young people who've been through the system are actually having an opportunity to weigh in. Like I mentioned earlier with the it's not just an advisory board, it's going to be a youth council, a commission of young people who have lived experience. And I think that hopefully will really shape the direction that child welfare and probation are going. The last thing I'll mention, because I think this is really exciting, is the Men's Central Jail that is going to be closed down in the next year. I didn't think that could possibly happen in our lifetime, right? That we would be closing jails in California, where we have the largest prison population in the world, in our state. So to see ideas coming up where we're saying things like, what, we need our alternatives to incarceration. People should not be in cages. We shouldn't have multiple generations of people in cages either. how do we get rid of those cages and create care instead of what we're seeing? And so I'm excited about the fact that the Board of Supervisors voted just a couple months ago to completely get rid of that jail and to figure out how do we have more resources allocated to prevent people from going in. Again, to your point, Professor Beckman, I don't think that these are novel concepts, right? But the process in which they have come to be, I feel like is a part of the social innovation process where community members have weighed in and said, this is what we want. And the people with the power have said, the people with the power are really the folks who said this is what we want, but the people who have power because they're in elected positions responding and saying, we hear you and we are going to move in that direction, I think it is innovative and more I want to see more of it.
Yeah, and so as you do this, I have so many questions for you, and I'll start to ask some of the questions from the audience as well. So as you do this social innovation work, sort of, what are some of the roadblocks that you see, and how do you overcome them to sort of get to moments like this where things that you didn't think could possibly happen are starting to happen? What were those roadblocks, and what got through them?
Yeah. So I think a few roadblocks. There are roadblocks I'm going to say on both sides. On both sides, I mean on the community side, right? Getting community members to believe that we can actually make a difference. So I'm a community organizer, not just by training. I've been doing community organizing since I was in high school. I was a community organizer in college, and then I was professionally a community organizer, like got paid to do a job that I loved before I came to USC. And so community organizing, right? In our community organizing work, we have a responsibility to help people believe that they actually have the power to make change for themselves, or that they can push on the folks who are the leaders to make the change, right? Because they're the ones who are the leaders. And so I think one of the challenges that comes with this work is really convincing the community that they actually do have power, because we've been disempowered for so long, right? We've been told that we don't matter. We've been told that our voices are not important. We've been told that we don't care about our own communities, right? Like when I look at where I grew up and where I live now, people constantly, talk poorly about South Central LA, to talk poorly about East LA, all these communities that are historically like communities of color, immigrant communities, and they demonize us and say we don't care about our community. And so some of us start to internalize that, right? As a child, I started to internalize that. Yeah, we don't care about our community. If we did, there wouldn't be so dirty here. Not understanding that there's this whole history of how we got to the way we are, right? Like I'm an urban planner by education, both undergrad and grad school. Redlining is real, right? There's, again, this history of how our communities got to be the way that they got to be. And so one of the challenges is getting folks to understand that, because that history has been erased from our history books. We're not taught, nobody told me about redlining until I went to, undergrad at UC San Diego and took courses in urban planning. And I was like, whoa, that's why my community looks the way that it looks. That's why, we don't have access to resources. These education practices, these laws in education are why I didn't have any AP classes in my high school, right? Why is it that I didn't even know what an AP class was until my teacher advocated for us? Like, those are the types of things that if the community doesn't know what's available to them because it was not been made available to them, it's really difficult for them to have a vision for what is possible. So I think that's one barrier. Though I will say the community knows what they want most of the time. They just don't know what is available to meet the needs of what they want, if that makes sense, right? And then I think the other barrier, again, as I mentioned before, is just having people who have power through election or are in positions of power because of their, the job that they have or the position they're in or the company that they work for, to get those folks to understand the value of the voices of the community members who are ultimately the beneficiaries or the folks who kind of get the short end of the stick if we're not thinking about them or including them in the process. And so convincing I don't like to use the word leaders, but convincing the people, I don't even like to use the word power because I feel like the people have the power, but convincing folks who have power in leadership positions, what I'm trying to say, convincing those folks of the value and the power that the community has is always a barrier in this type of work. And it's hard to overcome. So you have to do both of those things at the same time, right? Like you have to help the community understand the power that they have. And you also have to convince the people who have the power that these folks have power and that they will be able to wield it, and that you're here to work for them. Like, you are here, that your job is to actually work for the community. You need to be coming up with socially innovative approaches to solving the challenges in the community. If you're not doing that, you shouldn't be in the position you're in.
Yeah, and there's a couple questions here about that interface, which I think is so important that you raise, and doing that work on both sides. So on the community side, and thinking about, maybe about your grassroots organizing, but maybe more broadly, what are the ways that you've discovered to for youth in particular to help them sort of engage and be part of feeling a voice, to be engaged in social change during a climate that's been so divisive and so traumatic?
Yeah, I think so. The youth give me so much hope, right? Because the young people that I've had the opportunity to work with, they are always the first ones to recognize the power that they have. So I feel like sometimes they're jaded, but when you give, the more information they have, it's like me when I was a young person, the more information I had, the more my mind was blown, and the more I realized, like, oh, I can actually do something about this, right? And so for the youth, it's actually, for me, it has not been that difficult to get them to engage, because I don't know, they're just cut from a different cloth. Like, this is the generation of students. I think about the students who have been pushing for LAUSD to get rid of school police and give those resources to the students and the schools, to have school nurses, to have counselors, to help them, prepare for college. When you think about that, it's like, who are we talking about here? What schools don't have college counselors? What schools have police and are not giving resources for, intervention? And it's schools in Black and brown communities, right? 70% of LAUSD students are Latino, and I think it's like actually 90-something% are Black and Latino students, right? Why is it that those schools don't have those resources? Well, those students know, especially in this age of technology, where they can see, how other students are living and what they have access to. Those students look at that and say, why don't I have that? I deserve that too. I need that. I'm going to advocate and fight for it. So I love the fact that that's kind of their orientation, and they get out there and they have no qualms with telling folks that they speak truth to power, right? They're like, listen, the truth is, I was assaulted, or my friend was assaulted by the police, or they got pepper sprayed by that cop, and they didn't need to be pepper sprayed. What they needed was, to have a restorative justice circle. And so you need to figure out how we're going to get restorative justice circles in school and not have police coming in and doing random searches and pepper spraying my friends. Like, that's what they say. And they go and they show up at LAUSD school board meetings and they advocate for that. The young people that I work with who come out of like foster care and probation, or who are currently in those processes, I've had an opportunity to take them to DC to meet with Congress members. And they are so eager to share their stories. They are so eager. They know the power of their story. They know that they've been wronged by the system, right? They recognize, you ripped me away from my parents. That was not okay. My mom might have been using drugs, but she was self-medicating, and I understand that. And you caused more hurt and harm in my life by taking me from my mom than you did by just helping my mom to get better. Why didn't you just help her get better? So they have like the heart of a child, where they're just like, this doesn't make sense. If my mom needs help, why don't you help her instead of taking me away from her, right? And so I think that, these young people, they know what they want and they go for it, and I love it. The other question was around the not so young people.
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking that, as you work on, talking to the community and convincing the community to use their voice and speak, I've done some work in education, and I feel like sometimes it's we've been here, we've done this, we've tried this, it didn't work. There's sort of a hopelessness of, people have talked about it changing and it never has. Why should I believe you now? And I wonder, the youth don't have that history. I mean, that's the advantage of not having that history. And they can be optimistic that my story is powerful and it makes sense. How could you not see that there's a clearly an answer to make this work better than what we're doing? I wonder if that resonates with my experience as well. I say so the question on the other side was, if you are an elected official and you want to engage the community, you want to involve them, what are the barriers that keep that engagement from happening? And how do you convince them to sort of let go of that and really truly try and involve the community in the planning and in innovative processes? citizens?
Yeah, I think so. A few things. This is a very complex. I'm not going to be able to get into all of like what the barriers are, right? Because some of the barriers are honestly that they're in the pockets of the people who give them money, right? If the community, that's just the honest truth for elected officials, for the ones that I've seen. Sometimes they want to do what's right, but they owe somebody something, and I think that's really unfortunate, right? So when you have elected officials, I've seen some of this media recently, unfortunately, right, with some elected officials here in Los Angeles that have made some pretty bad decisions to, for example, respond to developers who want them to operate in a certain way, and that's not okay. It's just not okay that they do that. So I think that's one of the barriers. Another barrier is when if there's no accountability, right? If the elected officials are not held accountable by the community, then they don't feel that they need to do anything for the community. I'm not saying that's all elected officials, but that has been my experience with a lot of elected officials who have been hesitant and reluctant to engage with community members, because if historically the community members have not come in and used their voice and their power, then there's no reason for them to believe that they're going to do that moving forward, which is why when I taught the social innovation class, I focused on social movements and the power of getting community members to actually push for change, because in my research, from history and then also from being involved in these types of movements, especially right now, it is literally when the community rises up and says, you need to do this and we're going to demand it and we're going to keep showing up until you do it, that's when you see the change, right? Mayor Garcetti had no intention of cutting $150 million out of the police budget until community members said, yo, this is not okay. We're in the midst of a pandemic. You're going to give pay raises to the police and you're going to cut every other aspect of the city's, all the other departments. That doesn't make any sense. We don't even have enough PPE for our medical practitioners in our city. Why would we do that? Right? But yet that was the budget that was being proposed by the mayor's office. And that was the budget that the city council was going to move forward with until the community said, no, this is not acceptable. This is not what we want. You need to change your tune. It's not, the community didn't get everything that it wanted, but the community did get, right? There was some leverage there. Okay, we will cut this portion of the police budget and give it to the community, because you're right, we do need that. So I think that the barriers are often lack of accountability. We owe somebody else something. If the community is not present, then the community doesn't know what's going on. There's no reason to respond to the community in this way, because people in power don't believe that the community has power until the community shows up. And I recognize that this is my own, right? Like I come from a grassroots community organizing background, and that's how we operate. We think of, the power that the collective has versus the power of a few individuals. And if we put you in a position, we've elected you, then you have to be held accountable to the collective, not to a handful of, special interests, because the community is not a special, it's the only interest you should really be focused on, not these other ones. So that's my take on that. And Baby Justice has some thoughts too. I don't know if you hear him in the back.
So a couple other questions here that I'll sort of slightly different.
Okay.
So one is about, so you do work with a lot of different types of organizations, a lot of different kinds of leaders. And so what kinds of tips or advice would you have for people that want to introduce change into their organizations, but those organizations have been resistant to change or very bureaucratic? So what would your advice be for those folks?
Yes. I think it depends on the organization. That's a really great question. So I've done a lot of work for the past, I think 3 to 5 years in the private sector, which is where I've seen, well, honestly, private, public, and nonprofit, I see a lot of reluctance to change. But I would say in the private sector, a lot of what I've seen to be successful is to do some work around, anti-racism, especially right now. People are really interested in how do we as a company respond to what we're seeing in the world around us, right? Like there's an uprising. We don't want to be the organization or the company that is not being responsive to the community's needs. So what do we do? So I think a lot of companies are so much more open right now to having conversations. They don't want to go real deep. They're not trying to get into the roots. They're not trying to change the system, but you can start by getting them into conversation around what their organization is doing or their company is doing internally. So I do a lot of consulting around equity, inclusion, diversity, and access. We don't do any check the box trainings, but we will work with companies to do, let's do a strategic plan around diversity, equity, inclusion. How do we make sure that access is incorporated into everything that we do, from internally, like with our team members, to our external work. And people are really receptive to that. So I would recommend, you don't have to come with Castillo Consulting Partners, but look for a lot of times they're willing to listen to an expert on the outside, right? Let's bring in a consultant to talk to us about what it would look like for us to move in the direction of being more diverse, equitable, inclusive. What would it look like for us to become an anti-racist company? What does that really mean? Depends on the company. And it is all a bunch of jargon until you actually get someone in there who can actually, help them think innovatively about what that looks like. With regards to moving folks in positions of power within elected bodies, I really do think that community organizing is one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful way to do that. People in leadership respond when they are being held accountable, right? If there's a level of accountability and the community, the people who have the power to elect them, to get them in office or out of office, if they're involved, I think that really does push them to think differently about how they are doing the work that they're doing. So I would encourage you, I always tell my students, you got to have an inside-outside strategy, right? If you're on the inside, you need to have people on the outside who are pushing. And if you really care about this, you can work with them, right? So it's kind of like a public-private partnership. One of my students asked me one time, but isn't that kind of, is that, what about my integrity? And I say, well, your integrity is not in question if your commitment is to the community, right? We are all public servants. This is the Price School, right? We're not a business school. I'm not trying to bash the business school, right? No, we love Marshall too, but this is the public policy school. Everybody is doing work that is intended to serve the public. So giving information to the public about what is happening in their best interest or not is a part of our job and our responsibility. So we shouldn't question our integrity if we're going and saying, hey, community organizations, here's some initiatives that we're looking at in the city. We want you to weigh in on this as early as you possibly can in this process. I don't know why people start to feel icky about that. Like, oh, should I be, as a planner, city planner, should I be giving information to these 5 different nonprofit organizations before the rest of the public has it? And I'm like, no, you all give that information to developers all the time. Why is it okay for you to give information to developers but not to the community, right? So I would say do some community organizing, get the information out to the community and have the community push from the outside while you're doing work internally.
Yeah, so related to that is sort of this thinking about pushing civic leaders. So how do you navigate elected officials who may say they want to include the community, but are making it harder for the community to become involved? And the instance that the question is coming from is sort of the LA City Council limiting public comments to 1 minute rather than 2 minutes. So how do you address things like that?
So, one of the, sometimes I regret, though I don't, I love my policy and MPL degrees, right? But sometimes I'm like, I wish I had become a lawyer, because this is when I call on my legal friends, right? This is not a very innovative approach, but I think sometimes we forget when there are violations to people's ability to be able to engage in the public process. I think we do have to rely on things that have worked historically, right? So I have ACLU members on speed dial, right? And I know that doesn't solve the problems immediately, but most of these issues are not going to be solved immediately. But I do think it's important for us to figure out, how do we create partnerships with folks who have skills and resources that would lend themselves to supporting the community and having their voices heard. So as on a community organizing side, yes, we have, limitations by some elected officials to people can only speak for 1 minute. Then I'm sending out, email blasts, text messages, posting on social media and saying, everybody call right now. I did that today, right? Everybody needs to call your state assembly member today to ask them to pass this certain legislation. Yes, they're going to try to limit you. The voicemail box is full. That's constantly an issue for us. The voicemail box is full. Okay, well then we're going to lobby them to get a bigger voicemail box. But in the meantime, send them an email and send a text message to this, to this place, and then tweet at them. And then also, so I think that's a part of the innovative process too, right? Like if you get a roadblock, you figure out another way to engage. And then you figure out that's the short-term solution. The Band-Aid is tweet at them rather than trying to leave a voicemail. The longer-term solution is pushing them so that they're not limiting people's access and ability to share their feedback with them by not having a voicemail system that collects all of that information, right? They're limiting us to 1 minute. Let's send a bunch of emails. Then everybody's sending an email. They're giving us, this is all happened in the past 6 months that we've been in quarantine, right? Well, okay, so now we've all sent email. We're sending emails, and then we're getting bounce backs. Okay, well then let's figure out another way. And then that's where we kind of circulate all of these different things. And now let's also talk about what is the long term. How do we get this to not happen again? And are they in violation of the Brown Act? Let's see. Let's call it the ACLU.
All right. So so you've got you're encouraging the community. You're trying to deal with the elected officials. You're thinking about the short run and what do we do today, and how do we simultaneously think about the long run. I mean, the number of inside, you have to be working on change on the inside, but you need the outside. The number of simultaneous efforts it feels like that are engaged in any one moment. It's such a large, so many balls that you're pushing forward. So one of the questions here is, appreciating you speaking of what support should we be doing to support you in your work?
Oh, that's really nice. Thanks for wanting to support. I think for me, the work that I do is not about me, right? It's about the community. And I think that the ways that people can support this work is really you should be lifting up the voices of other people. Figuring out how to, who are the most, I don't even like all the words that we have, I hate using them, right? Like most vulnerable. It's not even about being vulnerable. Who has been disempowered? Who has been disengaged? Who has been disenfranchised? And how do we create space for them? I would say taking a step back. If you're a person who has power, like I was invited recently to speak at another event around child welfare and education. And I thought, well, I can absolutely speak to that, but why not have someone who actually is recently out of the foster care system, who is a graduate of a community college and is now looking to transfer? Why not have that person speak about that? Because that is their current experience. I may be considered an expert on this because I worked in this position. I was the national organizing director of the National Foster Youth Institute. And so that was the reason I was invited, was having that experience and working with young people now through my Castillo Consulting Partners work. But I don't think my voice is the right one, because I don't need to be there speaking on behalf of somebody who could speak on their own behalf. So I think that to support, not me in the work, but to support this work, is to constantly be thinking about whose voice is the most important. Is there a seat at the table for them? And if there isn't, how do I give up my seat if I have one, to make sure that their voice is the one that's being elevated?
Terrific. Well, so another question here from one of a fellow alumni about running for office and the need for people to run for office, and a little question about when you're going to run for office, if that's something that you would consider. So what? Yeah, we've talked about sort of the community side, the community organizing side, the elected official side. How do you think about that for you? And
I saw that question came from Ivory. I had to look it up. I'm like, what fellow alumni said this? It was from Ivory. Ivory, hey, so nice to see you join us for the conversation. So I just want to be completely transparent. I don't have any aspirations for running for office. I just don't. That's not to say that I'm completely against myself running for office. I don't have aspirations to, though. I don't feel like that is my calling necessarily in life. I think that I'm living in my calling right now. I do think it's important for us to have folks, again, with lived experiences in elected office. And so in my work, I do think about how do we get these young people, especially young people, how do we start to cultivate them to be prepared for those types of roles in society? So when I think about this commission that I was just telling you all about, the youth commission for LA County, on my mind the whole time as I was doing this work is I want to know what the young people want to see in this. And I also want to make sure that whatever we recommend to the Board of Supervisors does not pigeonhole these young people within this one commission, right? I want them to be able to graduate from this commission for young people to this other commission that is not just for young people. And I want them to be able to develop those skills and have access to those opportunities. So one day they could be a person who's a board of supervisor, right? On the Board of Supervisors, I'm sorry. I want them to be able to see themselves in that. And the way that we're going to get them there is to start them here. And so I am constantly thinking about that. I like support campaigns for peers of mine. I have a lot of friends who are running for office, a lot of Price alum, fight on again, right? And I've had friends who reach out and say, hey, can you provide me with some consultation, free consultation? Can you look at these policy, initiatives that I want to put forward for my campaign around policing, around foster youth, around education, right? Around Black women in health, whatever the case may be. And I'm like, absolutely, I'll take a look at them and give you some recommendations for how you can strengthen those, or like say, what's working well, or pass them on to other people. Like, hey, you want more information about how to support foster youth in your campaign? Let me actually have foster youth tell you how to do that, because again, my voice is not the most important one here. So that's the way I look at it. I'm not trying to run for office in my lifetime. I don't know. Yeah. But I also wasn't sure when I would have, or if I would have kids, and God does things, I don't want to though.
Yeah. Well, and even you thinking about the social innovation process, sort of the social movements, the grassroots, the community, it seeps through everything that you talk about. I mean, it definitely feels like that's where your work is. So I appreciate you being able to speak with us about your social innovation work, about your perspectives on social innovation, and I, especially on the last day of your vacation, I hope we can leave you on an up and positive note about all these, all these participants who are eager to hear from you. So thank you very much for joining us. And I don't want to keep you any longer than we have already. But if anything you'd like to end with that I haven't asked you, or that I should have asked you along the way.
No, thank you so much again for inviting me to speak. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I don't mind. I mean, it is the end of my vacation, but I love this kind of stuff. I love being able to talk about the things I'm passionate about, and give folks some purview into the work that's happening on the ground with grassroots, for folks, especially folks who are in policy school, thinking about becoming elected officials themselves, or urban planners, public administrators. Trying to think. Things that we didn't cover. I think we covered a lot. Oh,
so there was one more question that came in that's just under the wire here that I think is a great one. If we could maybe close with that. So because we've had the protests, we've had COVID, we've had a lot of things that have made us look at the racial injustice more critically, and so the energy that Black Lives Matters, has, how do we keep that going when we're not in a pandemic? What elements, so what do we need to do to keep it up? And are there elements of the Black Lives Matter movement that you think we should be utilizing in other critical issues in society, sort of lessons learned there? So how do we keep going, and are there tools we should be using elsewhere?
Yeah. Okay, that's not an easy one to end on.
It's a big one. Yeah. It was just so good. I couldn't not ask it.
It is. Well, I think with regards to things that are happening now, I want to just really emphasize that the reason why Black Lives Matter has been able to rise to the occasion right in this moment is because Black Lives Matter didn't go away after a few years ago, right? So I think people have asked me, like, where did defund the police come from? Like, how did y'all just came up with that? And I've said to them, no, we didn't just come up with that. We've been organizing and planning and doing this work consistently since 2013, right? We have monthly meetings. And so I would encourage folks to be involved in BLM on a more consistent basis. I am not just a community organizer with Black Lives Matter. I'm on the policy committee and the policy team. And that means that, every now and again, I'm going up to Sacramento and advocating for certain policies related to policing and trying to help pass legislation there. We have regular, weekly protests in front of the Hall of Justice to say that Jackie Lacey, the current district attorney, has not prosecuted any cops in Los Angeles who killed anybody. She's prosecuted one out of it's like almost 620 at this point in the 7 years she's been in office. Everybody knows George Floyd's name. People now know Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. How many people know Ezell Ford's name, right? How many people know Grishario Mack's name, a young man who was having a mental health crisis and killed in the Crenshaw Mall by police who shot him in the back? these stories are no different than the stories that we're hearing in national news. They just happen to be here in Los Angeles. Nobody's heard of them. So I would say getting involved and being aware of what's happening in our own community. I actually just got an alert right before we started this conversation that one of our BLM members witnessed looked like LA County sheriffs just killed somebody today, right now, in South LA, not too far from USC. Are we going to hear about that? When do we find out this information? So staying involved, I think, is really important, and don't lose sight of the fact that these issues that we're seeing on a national scale are happening right here in LA, and even more widespread than what we're seeing in other places. So that's that. And then the second part of the question was around lessons learned.
It was too big of a question. It was unfair. I think that's actually a great place to stop, right? And to remind us that it just didn't come out of nowhere. That this has been a lot of work for a long period of time, and you were ready to take advantage of the moment, right, as it were, to make progress. I think that's an important reminder. This is you work a long time and you don't get results, but you don't stop.
Absolutely, and I love what you just said, because it reminds me of one of my favorite songs. It's from one of my favorite lyrics from a rap song, and it goes, "If you stay ready, you ain't got to get ready," right? And so if we stay ready, we don't have to figure out how to get ready at the last minute and scramble to make things happen. And I think that social innovation requires us to get ready, right? And stay ready so we don't have to get ready, because we're constantly thinking of innovative solutions. And then when the window of opportunity comes, as we talk about in policy school, right? There are these windows of opportunity, then you're ready to actually introduce your innovative idea and move us forward on this journey towards more racial equity and justice and all that good stuff.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing your insights with us, La Mikia. I really appreciate your time and energy. So on behalf of everyone at Price and USC, thank you for spending the hour with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Fight on, everybody. Take care.